Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the 8-ball ball python. The 8-ball is actually a completely black, patternless ball python. Sometimes it can be like a chocolatey brown, almost jet black in some cases, and there are some limitations when it comes to the 8-ball. If you actually work other genes into the mix, first you'd think, with an all black ball python, it's kind of difficult to work other genes into the mix, but as a matter of fact, you can actually have some significant effects working the right genes into the 8-ball to make some pretty crazy looking snakes. And the other thing is it's actually composed of the black pastel and the cinnamon, which look really close to each other and act the same in a lot of different combos. So if you actually took an 8-ball, which is allelic, you breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as black pastel, half come out as cinnamon. And a lot of times if you actually breed it to a multi-gene combo, you have one or the other in the mix. Sometimes you can't tell which one you have, if it's a black pastel or cinnamon that you actually end up with in a whole mix of other genes. So it can be a little bit more difficult to actually work with. So today I want to jump over to the internet and I want to show you the potential and some of the limitations and the confusion surrounding the 8-ball ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with these two snakes right here. This is actually the black pastel and the cinnamon. If you actually look at them side by side, they are pretty close in appearance. As a matter of fact, I've seen quite a few versions of each snake. Some of them can be really variable from one to the other. Yeah, so if you actually took an 8-ball, you breed it to a normal, half of them will come out black pastel, half cinnamon, and you can, I'd say in most cases, you can actually tell that the black pastel here on this side over here, this is kind of more of a gold colored snake. You have a lot more gold in the pattern. I've actually looked at a lot of black pastels and it seems like most of them have more of a kind of a gold color and a lot darker of a background compared to the cinnamon. As a matter of fact, if you actually take two black pastels and breed them together and make the super black pastel, usually it's a lot more darker black than the super cinnamon. The super cinnamon is a little bit browner than the super black pastel. And I want to show you what an 8-ball looks like. If you actually take these two snakes, you breed them together, 25% of the time you'll actually get an 8-ball. Take a look at this. This is what an 8-ball looks like, completely jet black. As a matter of fact, I pulled up a few more examples of an 8-ball. I kind of wanted to show you some of the variability. There's actually kind of a browned out 8-ball. This one looks really awesome, kind of in a figure 8. And one of the things I've heard about the 8-balls is they can be a little bit feisty. Some of the black snakes, like the 8-balls or like the super black pastel or the super cinnamon, a lot of times they tend to have, a little bit more of an attitude. It takes a little bit more TLC to actually tame them down, or so I've heard from a lot of breeders. And here is another 8-ball over here. This one is pretty awesome. A little bit more age on this one, a little bit more chocolatey brown compared to some of the black ones. And when it comes to the super black pastel and the super cinnamon, a lot of people, sometimes some people will actually avoid them because there are genetic anomalies where they can have some defects a small percentage of the time. And one of the defects, you can actually get some kinking in the spine where the spine's not completely straight. You get that with, certain lines of caramel albino, and certain genes are more prone to some of these defects. It doesn't happen all the time, but a lot of people kind of shy away from it. Another kind of a defect with the super black pastel and the super cinnamon is a lot of times you'll get what is known as a duckbill, and you can see it maybe just a little bit on this one where the end of the mouth is a little bit wider than a normal ball python, although I've never really seen a problem with the duckbill where it's really affects the health of the snake. It's just kind of a weird looking face on the snake, and a lot of people actually like the duckbills. I actually like some of the clown combos that have a little bit of a smaller head, maybe a smaller nose. Some of them look cute, and some of them, it doesn't really affect either the health of the snake or anything with the duck billing. It just usually is just kind of a unique look to the face of the ball python. And a lot of people will say that if you actually take the black pastel and breed it to the cinnamon and make the 8-ball, a lot of times the 8-ball is more resistant to kinking and duck billing. But you can see in this case, it maybe get just a little bit of duck billing. But if you kind of want to get into this project and get away from some of the genetic anomalies, the 8-ball is the way to go. So I wanted to show you another thing that's a little bit confusing when it comes to the 8-ball, and that is working the pied gene into the 8-ball. As a matter of fact, if you actually take the pied and work it into the super black pastel, that is what we call the panda pied, a really jet black and white snake, really awesome and really expensive too. And here's what happens if you work the one copy of the pied gene, just a het pied, into the 8-ball. Take a look at this. A lot of times you can actually see a little ringer, or sometimes you'll see a little bit of white coming up. It almost acts like kind of like a champagne het pied. Usually the champagne het pieds almost look like a visual pied, and it seems like almost always when you have an 8-ball het pied, it's not quite as extreme as the champagne, but a lot of times you'll see a little bit of a ringer or a little bit of white coming up the sides of the snake. And I kind of want to show you this one. Take a look at this one. This is a real 8-ball pied. This is actually the 8-ball with the pied, and a lot of times when you're working in the pied with the 8-ball or the super cinnamon or the super black pastel, I'd say in most cases you get a really high white snake, and a lot of times it is completely white. And in this case you get what's called as a white panda. It's actually not really a white panda, because the true white panda would be the panda pied, which is all white, which is the super black pastel with the pied. And this one is actually an 8-ball, I guess you could call it an 8-ball white panda pied, which is kind of a unique anomaly. And take a look at this. This is where it kind of gets a little bit confusing. I actually found this over on the European side of Morphmarket, and this is actually an 8, they're actually listing it as an 8-ball pied. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because if you actually make a snake like this, a lot of times you can be tricked into thinking it's either pied or het pied, depending on the breeding. And I would say, based on what I've seen, a lot of times, usually if you have a really high black 8-ball pied, you may actually have an 8-ball het pied. This may actually be the white from the het pied, or you could actually have a really unique anomaly where you have a high amount of black in an 8-ball pied. And I'd say really the only true way to actually test this is to actually breed it to something else, like breed it to a pied and see if you get a whole clutch of pied. And if you actually get half non-pieds and half pieds, then you know it's actually an 8-ball het pied. It can get really confusing when it comes to working pied or het pied into the 8-ball. So I kind of want to show you this too. This is another one where it is extremely confusing. As a matter of fact, this one's listed as a super black pastel cinnamon. And if you actually look close at this, this is the cinnamon and the black pastel are actually allelic. So in order to get a super black pastel cinnamon, it is virtually impossible to actually get this snake as listed, because essentially what you're doing is you can only have 2 genes of any one gene or any compatible genes in a ball python. So this is essentially the same as having 3 pastel genes in one ball python. You can't have 3 pastels. You can only have 1 pastel, or you can have 2, which is the super pastel, but you can't have a 3rd gene that is compatible with the same gene. So as a matter of fact, this is actually corrected here in the ad. If you look at some of the genetics over here in Morphmarket, it can actually trick you, because you're thinking you're buying a super black pastel cinnamon, but if you actually read the fine print on this one, this says it was actually produced by a black pastel champagne crossed with an 8-ball. So this is either a super black pastel or an 8-ball, so it's either one or the other. So you can either have 2 copies of the black pastel, this could be the all black super black pastel, or it could be the 8-ball with 1 copy of the black pastel and 1 copy of the cinnamon. But it can't be both as listed here in this ad. It gets really confusing when you're actually looking at these snakes and you're not aware that it's actually allelic. If it wasn't allelic, so for example, if you had like a super black pastel and a cinnamon, you could have that, but you can't have like a super and a single gene of the same compatible lines of different genes. It gets a little bit confusing. You really have to know your genes and which genes are compatible. It's almost like you really couldn't have a lesser super Mojave, because those are all compatible, and you can either have the super Mojave or you can have the lesser Mojave. You can't have all 3 compatible genes in the same snake. So I kind of wanted to show you kind of the limitations and some of the anomalies working other genes into the 8-ball. The first one I want to show you is a pastel, and I'd say in most cases the pastel usually brings out a lot of yellow in a lot of combinations, and it usually reduces the pattern. Here's what happens if you work pastel into the 8-ball. Take a look at this. Essentially what it does is it kind of gives it a little bit of freckles, and it really just kind of lightens it just a little bit. As a matter of fact, if you actually work 2 copies of the pastel into the 8-ball, this is what you get. You get the super pastel 8-ball, which lightens it even more, gives it a little more freckling through the snakes. So you can definitely tell the 8-ball is extremely visually dominant, especially when it comes to pastels and super pastels. So here is a bamboo. As a matter of fact, this is a picture of Bobby, the snake that I have around my neck at the beginning and the end of every video. I actually bought him over here on Morphmarket, and the bamboo is extremely visually dominant. Not as visually dominant as something like an albino, but in a lot of cases, you know, if you actually like work pastel into the bamboo, a lot of times the bamboo will completely mask the pastel. So it's kind of in the mid-range as far as visual dominance, working it with other genes. And here's what happens if you work bamboo into an 8-ball. Take a look at this. It completely wiped out the bamboo, and you end up with a patternless silver snake with a few freckles. That is pretty amazing. It definitely is more visually dominant than the bamboo, although the bamboo is bringing a lot of this color and really changing the appearance of the 8-ball, which I think is a pretty unique anomaly when it comes to working other genes in with the 8-ball. So this is actually another dark morph mixed with a lightning gene. This is actually the Ghi Fire. The Ghi is a really dark morph, and it really scrambles up the pattern. You mix fire in and it doesn't have much of an effect if you actually mix it with Ghi, because Ghi is really visually dominant. And here's what happens if you mix the Ghi Fire with the 8-ball, and take a look at this. It's amazing how the 8-ball can completely wipe out all the patterns, almost like a champagne. I'd say the champagne is a little bit more visually dominant than the 8-ball. The 8-ball is a little bit more forgiving when working with some combos, but with this specific combo and with the bamboo, you can definitely tell the 8-ball is dominating and pretty much wiping out all the pattern. And it's kind of interesting. You actually see definite changes in the color. You can see the silver snakes or the lightning snake, you know, with the super pastel, you can see it's a little bit lighter with the freckles. That's kind of interesting. And then with this one, you get, you know, it's not completely jet black. It's kind of giving you this bronze, kind of a brownish bronze color, and it's completely patternless. Pretty awesome. So here is the albino, and the albino I would say is probably #1 as far as visual dominance. If something can actually overwhelm the albino, then you know you have something that completely masks most of the other genes. And here's what happens if you work albino, which is a recessive mutation, into the 8-ball. Take a look at this. The albino, I think, won in this case, although the 8-ball completely wiped out all the pattern. But you can see it's like an albino colored snake with just a little bit of freckling of the albino. As a matter of fact, they call this the cue ball, the 8-ball with the albino. Kind of an interesting name. And you can definitely see it still has the red eyes from the albino. So here is the Pinstripe. This is kind of a level down from the albino. I'd say maybe in there with the bamboo as far as visual dominance, kind of dominating the pattern. The Pinstripe is pretty awesome. It's actually a dominant mutation. So if you breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as Pinstripe. It's pretty awesome. And it's pretty much as gold of a snake as you can get. It's actually one of my favorites. And here's what happens if you work Pinstripe into an 8-ball. And take a look at this. The 8-ball completely dominates the Pinstripe, and you get these, it's kind of interesting, you get these little pinstripe colored freckles all through the 8-ball with some of the white coming up the belly. Makes for a really impressive combination. So here's the last one I want to show you. This one's kind of interesting when you work it in with the 8-ball. This is actually the banana, which is another really visually dominant mutation. And the banana is kind of a change, morph that changes a lot from when it's a hatchling to an adult. It starts out with a lot of oranges and kind of these lavender purples, and when it grows up into an adult, it changes into like a two-tone yellow with a bunch of freckles all over the snake. And here's what happens if you mix banana in with the 8-ball. take a look at this thing. This is a crazy snake. As a matter of fact, this one's actually het pied, and you know, in a lot of het pieds, you get these ringers, almost a pied looking snake. You can almost be tricked into thinking maybe this is like a low white pied when you're working het pied into the 8-ball. And I like that it just really kind of, you know, changes the color of the snake, and it brings in a lot of these freckles from the banana. Makes for a really interesting combo. As a matter of fact, if you're looking at the prices at some of these, I didn't really look at any prices. This one is actually $1,500. So some of these are pretty difficult. You know, it's not really a very popular project. I think that's why the prices are pretty high, and it's an allelic combination. So you actually can't take something like this, breed it to a normal, and then reproduce it. You have to, it's almost like working a recessive project, because you either get the cinnamons or the black pastels if you breed it to a normal. So the only way to reproduce this would be to breed it to a cinnamon or a black pastel or something that contains one of those genes to actually reproduce this snake. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Jen Hutchins asks, do you ever have a problem selling your ball python hatchlings? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, when I first started in ball pythons, that was one of the things I was really worried about. I'm going to produce all these hatchlings. Who is going to actually buy all these snakes? And once you get into it, it's pretty amazing. You can actually sell them on Morphmarket. You can sell them at reptile shows. As a matter of fact, you can take all your hatchlings and walk into almost any reptile store. And a lot of times they'll actually take them at a discount, maybe wholesale. And a lot of times they'll actually trade you store merchandise for the relative value of a snake. So for example, if you had like a $300 ball python hatchling, you could trade it for $300 of store credit, because remember, they're getting stuff at a discount, buying wholesale, and then selling again in the pet store, and they're still getting almost wholesale prices if you actually just trade for store merchandise. As a matter of fact, that can be a little bit dangerous, because you can go into a reptile store and they'll buy almost anything you have on store credit, and it's almost like you're in on a wild shopping spree, buying all these reptiles and enclosures and supplies. It's pretty amazing. And how many people actually buy the ball python hatchlings? It's one of the things you definitely do not have to worry about. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.